The sun was sinking behind the far ridge, spilling a burnished glow across the little town of Red Hollow. The dust hung in the air like smoke, stirred by the last wagon rolling down Main Street. Folks were gathering in the square, faces drawn and silent, shadows stretching long across the cracked ground. At the center stood a young woman tied to a post, her wrists bound tight with coarse rope. Her dress was torn from the struggle, her hair tangled by the wind, but her eyes held steady on the horizon. There was no fear in them, only a quiet kind of defiance that made the men around her shift uneasily. The preacher's voice rose above the murmurs, sharp and righteous. He spoke of sin and betrayal, of loyalty to the white man's God, and the purity of their kind. His words cut through the cool evening air, echoing against the wooden walls of the general store and saloon. The townsfolk listened, nodding, some with hesitation, others with grim satisfaction. They all knew what she had done, or thought they did. She had loved a man who wasn't one of them, an Apache warrior who had ridden through the valley like a shadow from another world. To them, that love was unforgivable. She stood still while they called her names, her lips pressed together, her jaw set tight. A few women whispered prayers, some children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, their wide eyes full of something they didn't yet understand. The sheriff stood near the gallows, hat low over his brow, hands folded behind him. He'd known her since she was a child, had watched her grow up in this dusty town where nothing ever changed. He looked away when she caught his eye, as if he couldn't bear the weight of his own silence. A few yards away, an old man spat into the dirt. She brought this on herself, he muttered. No. Decent girl runs off with a savage. The crowd mumbled in agreement, but none dared to look toward the mountains. None dared to imagine what might be coming from beyond those dark ridges where the Apache still roamed. The wind carried the smell of rain and sage, and somewhere out there, thunder rumbled like distant drums. The girl remembered those mountains well. She remembered how the air changed when you climbed high enough, how the sky turned deep and blue, how the world below looked small and harmless. She remembered his voice low, steady, like a heartbeat under the stars. He had taught her words in his tongue, shown her the meaning of silence, and promised he would return for her. But the town didn't care for promises made under the open sky. They cared for rules and fear, and for keeping their world as small and safe as it had always been. When they found her sneaking back into town 3 nights ago, they dragged her straight to the sheriff's office. They didn't give her a chance to explain. They said she'd betrayed her blood, that she'd turned her back on her people. The sheriff hadn't argued. Maybe he thought he was saving her from worse. But now, as she stood in the square with the ropes cutting into her skin, she realized no one in Red Hollow had ever really known her at all. The bell in the church tower struck 7. The sound rolled across the empty hills, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the preacher nodded to the sheriff, and the crowd stepped closer. A woman shouted that she should beg for forgiveness. Someone else threw a handful of dust at her feet. She closed her eyes and took a breath, remembering his face, the warmth of his hand when he'd brushed the hair from her cheek. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, and she knew he was out there, watching. The sheriff cleared his throat. "You've got one last chance to speak," he said quietly. His voice carried a sadness he couldn't hide. "Anything you want to say before we carry out the order?" She lifted her head slowly, her voice steady, though her lips trembled from the chill. "I have nothing to say to those who hate what they do not understand," she said. The words seemed to hang in the air, sharp and heavy. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but she didn't look away. Her eyes searched the horizon, beyond the town, beyond the dust. Somewhere out there, the light was fading, and she could almost hear the faint rhythm of hooves. The preacher scowled, gripping his Bible tighter. "Then may the Lord have mercy on your soul," he said. He turned toward the sheriff. "Do it." The sheriff hesitated. He looked at her again, at the strength in her face. For a moment, he thought about cutting her loose, about telling them all to go home. But fear is a powerful thing, and in Red Hollow, fear ruled more than any law. So he nodded slowly, his eyes lowered, and gave the signal. A sudden gust of wind swept through the square, carrying dust and whispers. Then came a sound none of them had expected. Distant drumbeat, deep and rhythmic, rolling across the plains. It was faint at first, almost like thunder, but then it grew louder, clearer, closer. The crowd froze, heads turning toward the west. The preacher's voice faltered. The sheriff's hand went to his gun. Over the ridge came a line of riders, their silhouettes dark against the blood-red sky. There were dozens of them, maybe more. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust as they descended, moving like a wave, swift and silent. The sun caught on their spears and rifles, glinting like fire. The men of Red Hollow shouted in panic, some running for cover, others fumbling for their weapons. The preacher dropped his Bible. The old man who'd spat earlier crossed himself and backed away. The girl didn't move. Her heart pounded, but not with fear. She knew that sound, that rhythm. She'd heard it in the canyon, in the stillness of the night. It was the heartbeat of her love, the promise he'd made beneath the stars. He had come for her, just as he said he would. The first rider broke ahead of the others, his horse galloping hard. He wore paint across his face, streaks of red and black that marked his people's war cry, eyes locked on the square on her. The townsfolk scattered, screaming, some firing into the air, bullets snapping past the riders but finding no mark. The Apache warrior didn't slow. The girl could see him, now his hair tied back, his chest bare, his arms strong and sure as he raised his rifle. The sheriff shouted for everyone to stand down, but his voice was lost in the chaos. The rider charged straight into the square, his horse rearing with a cry. The girl closed her eyes as dust and shouts swirled around her. She felt the rope jerk, heard it snap. Then there was silence, broken only by the thunder of hooves as the rest of the riders surrounded the square. The townsfolk cowered behind barrels and wagons, too afraid to move. When she opened her eyes, he was there beside her, dismounting in one fluid motion. His hands reached for her, gentle but firm, cutting the last strands that held her wrists. She fell against him, weak with relief. For a moment, the world around them disappeared. There was no crowd, no guns, no preacher shouting curses, just the two of them, breathing the same dusty air, hearts pounding in rhythm. The sheriff stood frozen, gun drawn, but trembling in his hand. He looked from the warrior to the girl, then to the circle of riders surrounding his town. He'd known this day might come, though he'd prayed it never would. The preacher shouted that they were under attack, that God would strike them down if they didn't fight. But the sheriff couldn't move. He saw something in the girl's eyes, a kind of peace he'd never understood. The Apache warrior turned to the crowd, his voice calm but firm. "We came for her," he said, "no more." His words were accented but clear, his gaze unwavering. "You heard her again. We will not be so kind." No one answered. The only sound was the wind, rustling through the flags and dry grass. The people of Red Hollow, who had been so loud, so certain, now stood silent in the face of what they'd feared most to love, that defied them, a truth they couldn't destroy. He helped her onto his horse, his hands steady at her back. She looked once more at the town that had been her home. Some faces she recognized, some she no longer cared to. Then she turned toward the mountains, where the last light of the sun touched the peaks in gold. As they rode away, the dust rose behind them, swallowing the square. The drums faded into the distance, leaving Red Hollow quiet once again. But something had shifted that night. Something had broken free. And though the preacher tried to speak again, no one really listened this time. The riders disappeared into the dark edge of the valley, the sound of hooves fading into the wind. "Hey?" The girl didn't look back. Her hands gripped the warrior's waist as the cold air brushed her face, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and smoke. The mountains rose before them, sharp and endless, their peaks touched by the last light of the setting sun. She didn't know where he was taking her, only that she trusted him more than anyone she'd ever known. Behind them, Red Hollow shrank into a small cluster of lights, swallowed by the open plains. For the first time in her life, she felt both terrified and free. They rode through the night, stopping only when the moon was high. The camp was hidden in a canyon, surrounded by stone walls that glowed pale silver in the moonlight. Fires burned low, casting soft shadows over faces marked with paint and time. The Apache moved quietly, their eyes following her with curiosity, but not hostility. Some nodded in respect when the warrior led her through, others simply watched, unreadable. She could feel the weight of their silence, but also a strange sense of belonging, as if the earth itself was breathing easier here. He helped her down and handed her a blanket. His touch was gentle, his gaze steady. "You are safe now," he said softly. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She wanted to speak, to tell him everything, the fear, the shame, the loneliness, but the words stayed trapped. He led her toward a small tent near the center of the camp, where the firelight flickered against the red stone walls. "Rest," he said. "We're among my people now." As she lay down, the sounds of the camp filled her ears, the quiet murmur of voices, the soft rustle of the wind through the canyon, the faint beat of a drum somewhere beyond the fire. Her heart was still racing from the night's chaos. The image of Red Hollow flashed through her mind, the preacher's cold eyes, the sheriff's silence, the faces that once smiled at her now twisted with judgment. She thought of her mother, who had died when she was a child, and of her father, who'd taught her to read by lantern light. He would never have understood this kind of love, but he'd told her once that courage doesn't always look the same. She hoped he was right. Sleep came slowly. When it did, it was filled with dreams of running through the desert, of laughter echoing off canyon walls, of a sky so wide it made her feel small and infinite all at once. When she woke, the sun had already climbed above the ridge, warming the sand beneath her feet. The camp was alive with movement, children fetching water, women grinding corn, men mending weapons and saddles. Life here was simple, but it pulsed with rhythm and purpose. No one seemed hurried, yet everything was done with care. The warrior approached her carrying a bowl of food. "Adi," he said, "you will need your strength." She took it, offering a small smile. "Thank you," she whispered. He sat beside her, watching the fire. For a long while, neither spoke. Then she asked the question that had been burning inside her since the night before. "What will happen now?" He looked at her, his eyes deep and calm. "Now we wait," he said. "Your town will be angry. They may come for you." His voice was quiet, but there was no fear in it. "But you are one of us now. We will protect you." She stared into the fire. "They'll say you kidnapped me," she murmured. "They'll come with guns." He nodded slowly. "Then we will be ready." The days passed slowly, each one filled with a strange mixture of peace and unease. She learned to help with the daily tasks, gathering wood, grinding meal, and listening to the stories told around the fire at night. The Apache spoke of the land as if it were a living thing, a spirit that held them close and whispered truths in the wind. She began to understand their words, their rhythm, their patience. It was a world so different from Red Hollow, where everything had been about survival and fear. Here, there was quiet strength. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. At night, she'd lie awake listening for distant sounds, the echo of hooves, the crack of a rifle. Sometimes she dreamed of the town again, of the sheriff's face when he realized what he had done, or of the preacher's sermon that turned her life upside down. She wondered if the people she'd grown up with could ever see her as human again, or if she had become a ghost to them. A story whispered about with shame and disbelief. One afternoon, as she helped a woman weave baskets, a young boy ran into camp shouting in Apache. The voices around her grew tense, heads turning toward the canyon entrance. The warrior appeared moments later, his expression hard. "Riders," he said, "from the town." Her stomach tightened. She knew they wouldn't give up so easily. Red Hollow had always feared what it couldn't control. He told her to stay in the tent, but she couldn't. She followed him to the edge of the camp where the others were gathering. From the ridge, she could see them, 5 men on horseback riding slowly toward the canyon. The sheriff was among them. Even from a distance, she recognized his stance, his hat pulled low. They carried no rifles in their hands, but the way they moved told her they weren't here to talk. The Apache men stood tall, silent, their eyes fixed on the approaching riders. When the sheriff reached the base of the canyon, he raised his hand. "We don't want trouble," he called out. His voice echoed faintly off the rocks. "Came to talk." The warrior beside her didn't answer. The air felt thick with warning. "You've taken one of our own," the sheriff said. "We just want her back safe." She stepped forward before the warrior could stop her. "I came on my own," she said, her voice clear and steady. The sheriff's eyes widened as he saw her. "You don't have to stay with them," he said. "You don't know what you're getting into." "I know exactly what I'm doing," she replied. "You tied me up in front of everyone, called me a sinner. You were going to let them hang me for loving someone different?" The sheriff's mouth opened, but no words came out. Behind him, one of the men muttered something she couldn't hear. "This isn't the way," the sheriff finally said. "You can't live with them. You'll never be safe." She looked at the warrior, then back at the sheriff. "I was never safe in Red Hollow," she said softly. The silence stretched long between them. The wind blew dust across the canyon floor. Finally, the sheriff nodded, slow and heavy. "You've made your choice," he said. "But you know they won't stop there. The town's talking about a raid. They think the Apache will come for more." He turned his horse around, his voice low. "Be ready." When they were gone, the camp remained quiet for a long time. The warrior placed a hand on her shoulder. "He speaks truth," he said. "Your people will not rest." She swallowed hard. "They won't stop until they destroy everything they fear," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we will not hide." Over the next few days, the camp prepared. The men trained with rifles and bows, the women gathered supplies. The air grew heavy with tension. She helped where she could, but fear sat deep in her chest. She knew the people of Red Hollow. She knew what they were capable of when pride and fear took hold. And she knew this fight wasn't just about her. Anymore, it was about two worlds that had never tried to understand each other. One evening, as the sky turned violet and the first stars appeared, she found the warrior standing on the ridge, looking toward the plains. "They will come soon," he said. She stood beside him, watching the horizon. "If they do," she whispered, "will you still believe love can win against hate?" He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "Love is the only thing that ever wins," he said. "It may take time, it may take pain, but it always finds its way." Below them, the fires of the camp burned steady. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, and the wind carried the faint smell of smoke from the direction of Red Hollow. She didn't know if it was from their chimneys or something darker, but she felt the shift in the air. The time of peace was ending. She reached for his hand, her fingers trembling. "If they come for us," she said, "promise me you won't let them make you into what they fear." He looked down at her hand in his jaw tightening. "I promise nothing," he said quietly, "but I will protect you." She wanted to argue, to tell him that protecting her wasn't the point, that the world couldn't change if all they did was fight, but the words wouldn't come. The horizon flickered with lightning, silent and distant. They stood there together, caught between two storms, one in the sky, one waiting just beyond the plains, knowing neither could last forever. The storm broke that night. The wind tore through the canyon, snapping branches and scattering ashes from the dying campfires. The people huddled close to the rocks, their tents pressed low against the wind. The girl sat near the fire with the warrior beside her, his arm wrapped around her shoulders to shield her from the cold. The flames flickered across his face, casting sharp shadows that made his expression hard to read. She could tell he was thinking of what was coming, of the town gathering its anger like dry brush waiting for a spark. When the wind finally died down, a strange stillness took its place. The air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. The warrior stood and looked toward the mouth of the canyon. "They will move soon," he said. His voice carried the weight of certainty. "They will come before the next full moon." She knew he was right. Back in Red Hollow, anger would be rising like floodwater. The preacher would be filling the church with his thunderous words, warning them that the Apache meant war. Men would be oiling their rifles, talking about honor and protection, twisting fear into duty. The sheriff, caught in the middle, would try to reason with them, but she doubted anyone would listen now. She could picture him standing alone on Main Street, watching the horizon where she had vanished, knowing that his silence had helped build this storm. In the camp, preparations continued. The Apache trained harder, moving like shadows among the rocks. Scouts rode out each morning to watch the valley, and returned at night with quiet reports of movement near the river. The women hid supplies in the caves just in case they had to leave quickly. Even the children sensed something was wrong. Her laughter had grown quieter, replaced by whispers. "Thought." The girl helped where she could, fetching water, tending fires, but she felt the tension closing in. One afternoon, while gathering wood, she met an older woman named Tala, who had been watching her since she arrived. Tala's eyes were sharp but kind. "You have the spirit of a hawk," she said. "But hawks who fly between two worlds often find no place to land." The girl didn't answer at first. She understood the meaning. She wasn't Apache, but she no longer belonged to the white settlers either. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Do you think they will ever see me as one of you?" she asked quietly. Tala smiled sadly. "They may, or they may never. But what matters is not what they see, but what you choose to be." The words stayed with her through the day. That night, she found the warrior sharpening his knife by the fire. "You have led your people well," she said softly. "But they follow you because they trust you. What if fighting only brings them more pain?" He paused, his hands stilling. "Pain is already coming," he said. "Sometimes you cannot avoid it. You can only meet it standing tall." She wanted to believe him, but fear still lingered in her heart. Somewhere deep down, she hoped that maybe there was still a way to stop the two sides from destroying each other. Maybe the sheriff could still be reasoned with. Maybe not everyone in Red Hollow wanted blood. The next morning, as dawn spread across the valley, one of the scouts returned breathless. He had seen riders near the river, armed men wearing the colors of the town. The warrior listened without speaking, his expression unreadable. Then he ordered the camp to move deeper into the canyon for safety. The people obeyed quickly, packing their few belongings and leading the horses. The girl followed, glancing back toward the open plains. A strange ache filled her chest. She couldn't help but think of the sheriff again. He had always been a quiet man, bound by the rules of others. Maybe he hadn't meant to hurt her. Maybe he was trying to keep peace the only way he knew how. She remembered how his voice had trembled when he gave the order to tie her up. He wasn't a cruel man, but he had chosen silence when it mattered most. That night, as the camp settled in the deeper part of the canyon, she sat by the fire with Tala. "He will come," Tala said. "The one who wears the hat of guilt. I can feel it in the wind." The girl frowned. "The sheriff?" Tala nodded. "He has something to make right. But men who carry shame do not always bring peace with them." She didn't sleep much after that. The sound of the river nearby was calming, but her thoughts wouldn't rest. She kept seeing the faces from Red Hollow, the ones that had looked at her with disgust and fear. She wondered if any of them regretted what they had done. She wondered if any of them had asked why she had risked everything for the man she loved. The next day, the answer came. Just as the sun began to rise, a figure appeared on the ridge above the canyon alone, holding no weapon in sight. The guards tensed, arrows notched, but the warrior raised a hand for them to wait. The figure dismounted slowly and called out. The voice carried down, low and familiar. It was the sheriff. The girl's heart leapt and twisted at once. He looked smaller than she remembered, the dust of the trail heavy on his coat, his face drawn with exhaustion. When the warrior met him halfway, the camp watched in silence. They spoke briefly, their words carried away by the wind, and then the sheriff motioned toward the girl. She hesitated, then walked forward, her steps slow. The sheriff removed his hat, eyes full of something that looked like regret. "I didn't come to take you back," he said quietly. "I came to warn you." The warrior watched him carefully. "Speak," he said. "There's talk in town," the sheriff continued. "The preachers gathered men from other settlements. They're planning to ride out together. Not just a few this time, dozens, maybe more. They're saying they'll burn this canyon to the ground." The air around them seemed to still. The warrior's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. "And you came alone to tell us," the sheriff nodded. "I couldn't let it happen without trying to stop it. I don't know if I can, but you should know it's coming." The girl stepped closer. "You could still stop them," she said. "You could tell them the truth. I came willingly." He shook his head slowly. "They wouldn't listen now. It's too much pride, too much anger. You've become a story to them, something they can't understand, so they have to destroy it." The warrior looked at him for a long time, then said, "You are either with them or with us. There is no path in between." The sheriff's eyes lowered. "Maybe not," he said. "But I won't raise my gun against you. Not again." He looked at the girl, his voice softening. "You deserve peace, but I don't think either side will give it to you now." She wanted to thank him, to say that his warning mattered, but before she could, one of the scouts ran up from below. "Smoke on the plains," he shouted. "They are coming." The sheriff turned sharply toward the horizon. "You still have time," he said. "Move fast. They're half a day away at most." The warrior gave a sharp command in Apache, and the camp erupted into motion. The people began packing quickly, leading horses and gathering supplies. The girl felt her chest tighten as she watched the quiet order turn into urgency. Tala's eyes met hers briefly, calm but knowing. The sheriff lingered near the edge of the camp, unsure of his place. Finally, he said, If they find me here, they'll call me a traitor." The warrior looked at him with something like respect. "Then you have chosen your side after all," he said. The sheriff gave a tired smile. "Maybe I have." As the sun climbed higher, the Apache moved toward the mountains, following hidden paths through the rocks. The girl rode close to the warrior, glancing back at the sheriff, who watched them disappear into the wild land he had once sworn to tame. He didn't follow, not yet. Eyes lingered on the smoke rising in the distance. By nightfall, the camp had reached a higher ridge overlooking the plains. From there, they could see torches moving like fireflies far below, the settlers marching toward them. The girl's heart pounded as she counted the lights. There were too many. The warrior stood at the edge of the ridge, his expression calm but fierce. "They come with fire," he said. "Then we will meet them with the earth itself." The wind blew cold, carrying the scent of burning wood. Below, the faint sound of drums began to rise, not the Apache drums, but something rough and uneven, made by hands that didn't understand rhythm. The settlers were chanting as they rode, their anger carrying through the valley. The girl stood beside the warrior, her hand brushing his. "Do you think there's still a chance to stop this?" she asked. He looked at her, eyes steady. "Only if the heart of one man can speak louder than the hate of many," he said. And somewhere down there, in the darkness between the torches, the sheriff rode, again his mind torn between two worlds, knowing that whichever side he chose, the dawn would change everything. The night was restless. The wind carried strange sounds across the canyon, hooves pounding against hard earth, voices muffled by distance, and the faint crackle of fire that seemed to spread faster than the stars could blink it away. The girl stood near the ridge, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Below, the torches of the settlers moved like a river of flame through the valley. The sight filled her with dread, but also a kind of disbelief. These were the same. People who had shared meals with her, who had watched her grow up, who had smiled at her in passing. Now they were coming to destroy everything she had found peace in. The warrior stood beside her, silent and steady. His face was unreadable, his eyes cold with purpose. "They move fast," he said. "Faster than I thought." She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. If we send a message, tell them we don't want to fight, they'll stop." He shook his head. "They are not coming to talk. They bring fire because they are afraid." She swallowed hard. "Then let me go to them. Maybe I can make them listen." He looked at her sharply. "If you go, they will take you again. Or worse." "Then let me try," she said, her voice trembling with urgency. "If I don't, there will be no end to this. You'll fight, they'll fight, and the valley will burn." The warrior's jaw tightened. "You still believe they can change?" "I have to," she said. "If I stop believing that, then what's the point of all this?" He didn't answer. The firelight danced across his face, revealing a flicker of pain beneath his calm exterior. He turned away, calling his men together. She watched as they gathered near the main fire, their expressions grim, the weight of what was coming heavy in their silence. Down in the valley, the settlers were setting up camp for the night. The preacher's voice echoed through the darkness, rising above the crackle of flames. He spoke of justice and God's will, his words twisting fear into righteousness. The men listened, nodding, their rifles laid out beside them. The sheriff sat a short distance away, staring into the fire. He hadn't joined in the preacher's rally. His thoughts were far from holy words. He kept seeing her face, the girl tied to the post, the defiance in her eyes, the rope cutting into her wrists. He couldn't erase the memory. One of the younger men approached him. "You're quiet, Sheriff. You losing your nerve?" The sheriff glanced up, his voice low and steady. "You think this is justice?" The man shrugged. "She chose them. That makes her one of them." The sheriff sighed and rubbed the dust from his hands. "She chose love. It's not a crime." The man frowned. "You say that now, but you didn't stop us before." The words cut deep because they were true. The sheriff had stood by once, afraid to lose the town's trust. But now he saw where that silence had led to a fire that couldn't be controlled. When the preacher finished, the men spread out, checking their weapons. The sheriff rose, walked to his horse, and looked up at the dark hills ahead. He knew she was somewhere in those shadows. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, only that he couldn't be part of this any longer. Back in the canyon, the Apache had taken positions along the ridges. The warrior gave quiet orders, his movements precise, his tone calm. Every man knew his place, every weapon ready. They didn't fight for pride or hatred, they fought because they had no choice. Their home was here, in the earth and stone, in the rivers and wind. To leave it would mean losing everything. The girl tried to help, but the women told her to stay near the fire. Tala placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes the heart wants to stand in front of the storm," she said softly. "But even the storm does not listen." The girl shook her head. "If I do nothing, people will die. I can't let that happen." Tala's eyes were kind but weary. "Cannot stop men who march behind their fear. Maybe one man can." She looked toward the valley again, and a strange hope flickered in her chest. She thought of the sheriff the way he had looked when he warned them, the sorrow in his eyes. Maybe Tala was right. Maybe he still had a choice to make. As dawn began to creep over the horizon, the first gunshot shattered the silence. A scout cried out from the ridge. The settlers were on the move, pushing up the narrow paths that led into the canyon. The air filled with shouts, the echo of boots and hooves. The warrior raised his rifle and gave a single command. The Apache held their ground, waiting. The girl felt her chest tighten. "They're here," she whispered. The warrior nodded, his eyes fixed on the ridge. "Stay behind the rocks. Do not move until I tell you." She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He kissed her forehead briefly before turning to join his men. That single touch said everything: fear, love, and the unspoken truth that they both knew this might be their last dawn together. Down below, the settlers advanced through the brush, guns raised, eyes darting. The preacher rode near the front, shouting orders, his voice fierce with conviction. The sheriff followed reluctantly, his horse moving slower than the rest. He had tried to speak against the attack that morning, but no one had listened. Now it was too late to turn them back. When the first arrow whistled through the air and struck the ground near his horse, chaos broke loose. Gunfire erupted, echoing through the canyon walls. The settlers returned fire blindly, the smoke thick and choking. The Apache moved like ghosts among the rocks, swift and silent, their aim precise. The girl crouched behind a boulder, her hands pressed against her ears as the world exploded around her. The sound of rifles and screams mixed with the thunder of hooves. She could see flashes of movement, men falling, horses rearing, the warrior standing tall against the smoke. The sheriff dismounted and ran for cover, shouting for the men to hold their fire. But the preacher's voice rose above the chaos, calling them to push forward, to cleanse the land. The sheriff turned toward him, anger burning in his chest. "You'll get them all killed," he shouted. The preacher pointed his rifle at him. "You lost your faith, Sheriff. That's why you'll fall with them." Before the sheriff could respond, the preacher fired. Ow. The shot missed by inches, splintering a rock behind him. The sheriff dove behind cover, his heart pounding, looked up toward the ridge and caught sight of her. She was standing now, waving her arms, shouting for them to stop. "Go back," she cried. "Please, this doesn't have to happen." But no one listened. The noise drowned her voice. The warrior saw her from across the ridge, his face tightening with fear. He shouted her name, but the wind carried his words away. A bullet struck the rock near her feet, spraying dust into her face. She stumbled, falling to her knees. The warrior fired back, his shots precise, forcing the attackers to retreat for a moment. He rushed toward her, dodging bullets, his heart pounding. The sheriff saw it all unfold. He could see the girl, the warrior, and the preacher raising his rifle again. Something inside him snapped. He grabbed his gun and ran forward through the smoke, yelling for the men to stop firing. His voice cut through the noise, raw and desperate. "Enough. Stop this madness." But the preacher didn't stop. He fired again, the sound echoing like thunder through the canyon. The warrior turned just in time, the bullet grazing his shoulder as he reached the girl. Pulled her behind the rocks, blood seeping through his shirt. She cried out, trying to stop the bleeding, but he pushed her hands away. "Stay down," he said through clenched teeth. The sheriff climbed the ridge, the preacher shouting behind him for the others to press on. The smoke grew thicker, the air heavy with dust and fear. All around, the battle raged, worlds tearing each other apart in the name of pride and fear. The girl held the warrior's face in her hands, tears streaking her cheeks. "You can't fight them all," she said. He looked at her, his voice low and steady. "I don't need to fight them all. just the one who leads them. Below, the preacher rallied the men again, his voice rising above the chaos. The sheriff stopped at the edge of the ridge, his gun shaking in his hand. He looked down at the preacher, then up at the smoke curling through the canyon. He knew what he had to do, but it meant turning against everything he'd sworn to protect. The girl's eyes met his across the battlefield, and in that silent exchange he saw the truth. This wasn't about sides anymore. It was about right and wrong. The preacher raised his rifle again, shouting for the settlers to advance. The sheriff lifted his gun, his hand trembling. The world seemed to hold its breath as both men took aim. And then, before the shot could ring out, the wind shifted, carrying the sound of thunder from the mountains, a deep, rolling echo that made the earth tremble beneath their feet. The Apache warriors stopped firing for a moment, their eyes lifting toward the sky. The settlers hesitated, confused. The girl looked up, her heart racing. The storm was coming again, darker and fiercer than before. But the real storm was already there, alive in the canyon. Waiting for the moment that would decide everything, the storm rolled over the canyon with a low, trembling roar. The wind picked up the dust and smoke, swirling it into the sky until the valley disappeared behind a curtain of gray. Lightning flashed across the ridges, turning faces into fleeting silhouettes. The preacher's voice finally fell silent as the first drops of rain struck the ground. The battle had stopped, not because either side had surrendered, but because nature itself had taken control. The sheriff lowered his gun, his chest heaving. He stared across the canyon at the preacher, whose eyes burned with defiance even now. The thunder drowned out their words, but it didn't matter. Something had broken between them, something deeper than loyalty or belief. The sheriff turned away, walking down the slope, his hat pressed low against the wind. He was done fighting for causes that only destroyed what they claimed to protect. The warrior knelt beside the girl, clutching his wounded arm. The blood had stopped flowing, but his strength was fading fast. She tore a strip from her dress and tied it around the wound, her hands shaking. "It's over," she whispered, though her voice trembled with doubt. He looked up at the dark sky. "No," he said quietly. "Not yet." The rain grew heavier, washing away the smoke and the dust. The gunfire faded into silence. Men from both sides began to retreat, some limping, others carrying the wounded. The fire that had spread through the dry grass was slowly dying, drowned by the downpour. In that strange quiet, the sound of the rain felt almost sacred, like the land itself was demanding peace. The sheriff found his way to where the girl and the warrior hid behind the rocks. He called out softly, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. The girl turned, surprised, unsure if she could trust him. He stepped closer, his face tired and streaked with mud. "You need to move him," he said. "The men will come back once the rain stops." She hesitated, then nodded. Together they helped the warrior to his feet. The three of them made their way toward the cave near the river, stumbling over slick stones. Inside, the air was cool and damp. The warrior leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. The sheriff knelt beside him, removing his coat and pressing it against the wound to keep it warm. "Are you helping us?" the girl asked quietly. He looked at her, his eyes heavy with guilt. "'Cause I should have stopped this before it started. I let fear run this town. Now, too many have paid the price." The girl's voice softened. "You can still make it right." The sheriff nodded, though he didn't seem sure what right meant anymore. Outside, the storm began to fade. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the first light of dawn broke through the clouds. The canyon looked different, not cleansed, but scarred. Smoke still rose from the burned grass, and the bodies of the fallen lay scattered across the valley. It was quiet in a way that felt almost unbearable. The warrior stirred, his voice weak. "Your people," he said to the sheriff. "Will they come again?" The sheriff shook his head. "Not if I can stop them. The preacher's hold is broken. After what happened today, the men will think twice before following him anywhere." "And what about him?" the girl asked. The sheriff hesitated. "He ran when the rain started. Maybe he'll keep running." But deep down, he knew the preacher wasn't done. Men like him rarely disappeared. They just waited for new followers. Still, the sheriff also knew something had changed. The men who had once listened to the preacher's words had now seen where they led to death and ruin. The power of fear had been weakened, if only a little. They stayed in the cave until morning. The warrior's breathing grew steadier. The girl kept watch by the entrance, listening to the faint rustle of the wind. When the sun finally rose, it spread a warm glow over the land that had been covered in darkness for so long. By midday, the sheriff rode back to town. He left the girl and the warrior in the care of their people, promising to return. As he rode through the valley, the devastation was everywhere: burned wagons, broken rifles, and the remains of pride scattered in the dirt. When he reached the outskirts of town, people came out to watch him pass. No one cheered, no one spoke. They just watched in silence, their faces pale and uncertain. The preacher was there too, standing on the steps of the chapel, his clothes still stained with dust and rain. "You turned against your own," he said when the sheriff approached. The sheriff stopped his horse. "No," he said quietly. "I turned toward what's right." The preacher sneered. "You think they'll forgive you? You think they'll live in peace with those savages after what's happened?" The sheriff looked past him at the faces in the crowd. "Maybe not today, maybe not for a long time. But one day, they'll understand that hate only leaves ashes behind." The preacher stepped forward, his hand twitching near his belt, but the sheriff didn't move. His calmness unsettled the crowd. Finally, one of the townsmen stepped between them. "That's enough," the man said. "We've all had enough." The preacher's eyes widened as he realized the crowd wasn't with him anymore. His words had lost their fire. Slowly he backed away, muttering under his breath, and disappeared down the street. The sheriff dismounted and walked toward the old jailhouse. He unlocked the door, hung his badge on the wall, and left it there. He knew his time as lawman was over. His duty now was something else, something quieter, but more meaningful. Weeks passed, the valley began to heal. The rains brought green back to the burned earth, and the river ran clear again. The Apache rebuilt their camp deeper in the canyon, away from the main trails. The girls stayed with them, helping care for the wounded, earning their language more fluently and finding comfort in the rhythm of their daily life. One afternoon, she walked along the riverbank and found the sheriff waiting there. He looked older, but his eyes were gentler. "You kept your promise," she said. He smiled faintly. "I tried. The town's changing, slowly. Folks don't talk much about what happened, but they don't look at the hills the same way anymore. Maybe that's a start." They stood in silence for a while, watching the river move. The warrior joined them, his arms still bandaged, but his spirit strong again. He nodded to the sheriff, a gesture of respect that said more than words could. "Your people fought well," the sheriff said. "We fought to live," the warrior replied, "and to remember." The girl looked at both men, realizing how far they had come. 3 lives bound together by loss, yet changed by something deeper than pain. "Maybe that's what the land wanted," she said softly, "for us to remember." The sheriff glanced at her. "Remember what? That this land isn't ours or theirs," she said. "It belongs to those who care enough to protect it." The warrior nodded. The land forgives when people learn. The wind carried the scent of pine and rain. Birds circled high above the cliffs, their cries echoing through the canyon. The sheriff watched them for a long time before speaking again. "I think I'll stay out here for a while. Maybe help rebuild the old cabins by the river. Town doesn't need a sheriff right now." The warrior smiled faintly. "Then you'll be welcome here." The girl reached out and took the sheriff's hand. For the first time in a long while, she felt peace, not because everything was fixed, but because something good had begun to grow in the ruins. By evening, the sun dipped low, painting the canyon in shades of gold and amber. The river shimmered like a mirror, reflecting the calm after so much storm. The warrior walked ahead, leading the way back toward camp, while the sheriff and the girl followed. Behind them, the valley stretched wide and silent, its scars slowly fading under the touch of light. In time, stories of that day became whispers told by firelight, remembered by few, but felt by many. They spoke of a girl who stood between 2 worlds, a warrior who fought for his home, and a sheriff who chose truth over fear. The land remembered them as it always did, holding their story in the wind and the soil. And though the years would pass and the valley would change, the peace they had fought for remained like a quiet promise. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, when hate and loss seem to rule, the smallest act of courage can turn the tide and heal what once was broken.